I had a great history teacher when I was at school. We used to call him Jumbo. That wasn't his real name. I think he was called George Ayres. Um, but he was short and he was stout and he had an amazing memory, so we called him Jumbo. And the thing that I loved about him was he could tell stories. He could tell amazing stories. He knew the facts of history, but he coloured them in with these amazing details that made the lessons come alive. And because of Jumbo, history was always my favourite subject. When I finished school, I went to university. I did a history degree. I became a history teacher, and I've always loved history, and I've loved telling stories. Now, I've never kept a blog. I've always written. But I've never blogged online. And I thought that one thing I could do at the moment, in this weird season that we're in, confined to our house with the coronavirus, and this is now the fifth day of confinement for me, I thought I could do something that would be both positive and therapeutical for myself. And that would be just to tell a few stories. Stories from my past, my history. That's what I've got. and so these last few days I've been digging back through old journals and looking at past letters, and I'm really glad that I've kept so much stuff from over the years. And so I thought I would tell a few stories over the next few days and maybe weeks, depending how long this goes on for. I thought this would be good for myself and good for my kids one day as well. So where to start? Well, maybe today I'll just start with some context. Two of my favourite books, which I read back at university, were the biographies of Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor was one of the early sort of missionaries to China. He was a Protestant missionary. He was one of the grandfathers, I guess, of the modern Protestant mission movement. He was an amazing guy. And I read these big biographies. They're kind of 800 pages long, each of them probably, 600 pages long, back at university, so 30 plus years ago. And I remember very vivid memory of reading this biography and being incredibly struck by his lifestyle. He was a guy who went to China, had very strong ideals on how he should live, how he should live in a way that was really identifying with the Chinese people. He became like a Chinese person. He dressed like them. He shaved his hair and grew a long plait of hair at the back. He ate very simply. He learnt the language amazingly. He lived a very simple life of faith. He was one of the early faith missionaries who wasn't paid a salary. He prayed and he depended on God to touch people's hearts to give. And I found his story very inspiring. There was one detail in the story that really struck in my memory, and it's been an abiding memory ever since. In his bedroom in China, he had, on either side of his bed, he had two scrolls. And in Chinese letters, I guess something similar to this, on each of these scrolls on either side of the bed, there was a word. On one side of the bed, it said Jehovah Jireh in Chinese letters, and on the other side of the bed, it said Ebenezer. Now, these two words, two names, are stories from the Old Testament, and they really came to, I suppose, define Hudson Taylor's life. And let me just explain a little bit what I mean by that. Jehovah Jireh is a name for God that we come across in Genesis chapter 22. It's a story, well-known story, of Abraham and his son Isaac. Isaac has been born, and God tests Isaac. He tests him and challenges him to go to a faraway mountain and to sacrifice Isaac, his only son. It's a strange story. God seemingly telling him to make a human sacrifice, but what we see later in the story is that God was testing him to see how much he would trust God and how much he would obey God. So Abraham takes his son, he travels for 3 days, he climbs the mountain that he goes to with his son. He's carrying a bundle of wood to make a fire and an altar. He's carrying his knife, and Isaac is walking with him up the mountain. And Isaac naturally says to his dad, "Dad, we've got the wood, we've got the fire, we've got the knife. Where's the sheep for the sacrifice?" And Abraham says very simply to Isaac, God will provide. They get to the top of the mountain. Abraham makes the altar. He creates a fire. He's just about to sacrifice his son Isaac. And God stops him. And we hear the voice of God speaks out to Abraham and says, now I know that you're trusting me because you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Stop. So Abraham stops. He looks up, and there it says that in a thicket, in a tree, a bush, he sees a ram caught by its horns in the bush. He takes the ram, he slaughters it, he sacrifices it, and he says to his son Isaac, God has provided. And from that point on, Abraham calls God Jehovah Jireh, which literally means God will provide. So Abraham had a revelation there of the character of God. God challenged Abraham, God tested Abraham, and because Abraham responded with faith, he had a personal revelation of the character of God. And based on that revelation, he knew that God was a provider. So he knew, as he looked forward to the promises in his life, he had many promises over his life. God had promised him a land. God had promised him that he would become a nation. God had promised that through his offspring, through his seed, all the nations on earth would be blessed. And somehow Abraham knew that because God had provided, God would continue to provide in the future. So Jehovah Jireh was a name that Abraham gave to God based on his revelation, his personal revelation of the character of God. And as he looked forward to the future, he could say, God will provide. So on one side of Hudson Taylor's bed, he has this scroll which said, Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. And if you like, that's looking forward into the future. I know in the future God will provide. But how do I know that? How do I know God will provide? Well, on the other side of his bed, Hudson Taylor had this other scroll that said Ebenezer. Now, Ebenezer is another Old Testament name. It occurs in the book of 1 Samuel. We first come across the name, and it's a place name. We first come across the place name Ebenezer in 1 Samuel chapter 4. The Philistine army have attacked the Israelites. The Israelites are not living a good life. They're not obeying God. They're not following God. And they're being attacked, and they're in grave danger of being defeated by this huge army. And the Israelite army take the Ark of the Covenant from the tabernacle, and they take it out into battle with them, which was a foolish thing to do. And it was almost as if this was a lucky charm for them. They took it into battle, trusting that with this ark with them, they would win the battle. In actual fact, 30,000 Israelite soldiers are killed, the high priest's sons are killed, and the ark is captured and taken into captivity. And it's a tragic day in the history of Israel. And it happens at a place called Ebenezer. That was the name of the place where the battle was fought. So Ebenezer, for the Israelites, was the name of a place where they'd had probably their greatest defeat, the worst day in their history. The army has been defeated, the high priest's sons have been killed, the Ark of the Covenant has been taken into captivity. That day, the high priest Eli, when he hears the news that his sons are dead and the ark has been captured, he falls over, he dies. And Samuel, who's a young lad at that point, who is a young prophet growing up under the care of Eli, for the next years becomes, as he grows into manhood, he becomes a prophet over the nation of Israel. At some point, and this is another story, but at some point the Ark of the Covenant is sent back to Israel by the Philistines, who realise that they're coming under curses because they've got this ark. But 20 years goes past. 20 years pass, and Samuel grows up, and he's prophesying to the nation. And there's something of a revival. The nation of Israel come back to God. They repent, and Samuel leads them in a nationwide repentance, if you like. And a whole group of people gather together, and Samuel is leading them as they're turning back to God. And the Philistines hear that all these Israelites have come together, and they attack them. And once again, the Israelites see this huge Philistine army coming towards them, and they are terrified. And Samuel cries out to God on their behalf, and God hears. And there's thunder, and God acts on their behalf, and this huge Philistine army are defeated by God. And once again, it happens at a place called Ebenezer. 20 years after this first defeat, God acts on behalf of the people at Ebenezer, and a huge victory is won. And Samuel then takes a group of stones and he builds a pillar. He builds a memorial. He sets it up and he calls it Ebenezer. And it tells us in the margin, this is in 1 Samuel chapter 7, it tells us in the margin that Ebenezer means hitherto God has helped us, or stone of help. Up to this point, God has helped us. So Ebenezer, this place of defeat, became a place of victory. It became a place where God acted on behalf of the people of Israel, and they knew that God had acted for them. And Samuel the prophet builds this memorial stone. He builds a pillar, and he calls it Ebenezer. Up to this point, God has helped us. And this memorial, this pillar, becomes a history lesson for the people of Israel. It becomes something that they can look back to. It's a physical, tangible sign that at this point in time, God acted on our behalf, rescued us, and provided for us. Up to this point, God has helped us. So Hudson Taylor, this pioneer missionary to China, has on one side of his bed a scroll that says Ebenezer, and on the other side of his bed a scroll that says Jehovah Jireh. Ebenezer, up to this point, God has helped us. Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. In the past, as I look back, I can see that God has helped me. I've got my memorial stones, my pillars that help me remember that God was with me on this day. This was part of my story, Ebenezer. And because I have Ebenezers in my life, I can look forward to an uncertain future and say, Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. Because God was with me in the past, I know that in the future, God will continue to provide. Throughout the Old Testament, we see many times where the people of Israel are told to pass on the stories to the future, to the next generation. They're often building pillars, stones of remembrance, like the Ebenezer stone. And when people look at these pillars and ask, what's this pillar here for? The older generation would then tell them the story that this pillar was a marker of. One of my favourite verses is in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29, and it says, the hidden things belong to God, or the secret things belong to God, but the revealed things belong to us and to our children forever, so that we can obey all the words of the Lord. The hidden things, the secret things, belong to God. There are some things we simply do not know. We don't know what the future is going to hold. We don't know. But the things revealed to us belong to us and to our children forever, so that we can walk in all the ways of the Lord. The secret things belong to the Lord, but the things revealed belong to us. Now, when we've lived through something, like Abraham lived through this episode with this test with Isaac, when we've lived through something and we have proved something of God, we've discovered something of God's character as God reveals himself to us, those revealed things belong to us. We can call God Jehovah Jireh because he's revealed himself to us. Those revealed things belong to us. We have to take them and we have to own them. They're part of our story. They've shaped us. They're the things that have made us who we are. And they belong to our children, so that we can all walk in the ways of the Lord. Now, how are they going to belong to our children? Well, they belong to our children as we, this generation, make our Ebenezer stones, as we build our pillars, as we tell our stories of what God has done in the past, so that the next generation can look forward into an uncertain future and say, because God was with my parents, because Ebenezer, up to this point, God helped them, I know that in the future, Jehovah Jireh, God will continue to provide. The Maoris have a saying that we walk backwards into our future. We walk backwards into our future. We walk into the future looking back at history. And it's really important to remember history. So I thought that what I would do over these next few days is to tell some stories, much shorter than this one. I think this is just the first one to get me going. To tell some stories, and these will be my personal Ebenezer stones. I want to tell some stories that will be for my children. That will be for me to look back on and say, up to this point, God was with me. Up to this point, God helped me. And so therefore I know that as I look forward into an uncertain future, God will continue to provide.